Nick Abbot on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Simon Marks is LBC's Washington correspondent, and he joins us from there on the line. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Nick. I've got the local lurgy, but it's not as though there's been anything stressful or debilitating going on. I don't know why. It's extraordinary that I've fallen sick, but I'm sure we'll battle through this.
Yes. Well, what's been the way that the American media have dealt with the incident on Friday? Because around the world, the media, even right-wing media and left-wing side by side, they seem to be speaking with one voice. They're all appalled. How's it playing in America?
Well, it's completely polarised here because everything always is completely polarised here. So, I mean, certainly there was massive amounts of amazement and shock at those appalling and, I think, entirely premeditated scenes that played out in the Oval Office on Friday when Volodymyr Zelensky arrived to be ambushed by the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, and his boss, the President. It was, of course, the lead story on all the network newscasts. But if you watched the Sunday television talk programs here today, particularly those on right-leaning media, supporters of the Trump administration were not in any way backing down, even while Volodymyr Zelensky was in London being embraced by the King, by the Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, by European leaders, trying to engage in a reset in the aftermath of Friday's catastrophe, coming together to accept and provide Ukraine with additional amounts of military support, and now pledging the British and the French to sit with Zelensky and try and come up with proposals that they can then take to the White House on his behalf. Even as all that was going on, the president's sycophants and apostles were all continuing to pile on Zelensky. Take a listen to the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, speaking on on Fox News earlier today.
Coming to the Oval Office, with the body language, the shaking of head, the kind of the arms crossed, we found it incredibly disrespectful. We were ready to sign that deal. I want to address directly that this was some type of ambush is absolutely false. We had negotiated the minerals deal in the weeks prior. It was difficult, but it was done and finalized and ready to be signed in the East Room.
So they continue to portray Zelensky, the most heroic figure Europe has seen since 1945, as a petulant schoolboy. And it all began when Trump went to the front door of the White House, stood under the portico, and welcomed Zelensky as he stepped out of the limousine. And Trump immediately started poking sarcastic fun at his manner of dress and shouted to the reporters, he's really dressed up for this one.
Yes.
And then, of course, that issue was picked up by a propagandist working for a far-right pro-Trump web and broadcast network called Real America's Voice TV. I think we spoke about him last week, this guy, Brian Glenn. He happens to be the partner of Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia congresswoman who believes in a whole host of conspiracy theories.
Yes.
And he's now front and centre in the Oval Office because his organisation and other right-leaning organisations, Breitbart News, the Daily Caller, all of these right-wing outlets are now part of the pool that covers Donald Trump. Reuters and AP didn't get into the Oval Office for that encounter with Zelensky. So Brian Glenn's there. He's that idiot who asks the question about why don't you have a suit and really pushes Zelensky. And actually, I think that was the point during this 45-minute encounter that Trump forced Zelensky to endure, that things really started going off the rails. And I think it's also just worth making the point. We saw 3 times last week the President of the United States with Emmanuel Macron on Monday, Keir Starmer on Thursday, and Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday, turning a basic photo opportunity in the Oval Office, where normally the president welcomes his guest and says, thanks very much for coming, it's lovely to see you, and the guest says, thanks very much for having me, it's lovely to be here. And then, there might be a question or two, and then the cameras are excluded from the room so the serious talks can get underway. this president, in exactly the same way as he did with his cabinet meeting 10 days ago, turning that into there was no cabinet meeting, it was a made-for-TV reality show. So were these talks with Zelensky, and how the British and the French are going to condition future occasions when their leaders are in the Oval Office, or when Zelensky comes back to the Oval Office. He says tonight that he's ready to sign this minerals deal, even though there are massive questions over the security guarantees that the Americans may or may not be providing as they extort Ukraine of its rare earth mineral wealth. How are you going to negotiate with this American administration where Trump is a showman who wants to dress people down on television rather than going behind the scenes and getting involved in the hard work of diplomacy? I mean, Henry Kissinger, he ain't.
It's also rather pointless to sign anything with Donald Trump because he is just like Putin. He is the kind of person who doesn't think that any of the terms of the deal that he's just signed apply to him. He spent about a week saying what kind of idiot would sign this deal, waving around the deal that was signed between America and Canada and Mexico, the trade deal, saying, well, this is a stupid deal, only a moron would have signed this deal, presumably forgetting that he was the moron. The first time around, in his first presidency, he was the person that signed that deal, which is now the worst deal in the world, and he tore it up and has threatened, of course, to levy tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So his signature is not worth the paper it's printed on.
Right. I mean, in the best case scenario, you're going to have four parties to this peace negotiation. The Europeans, in the form of the British and the French, representing the other European leaders, Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin of Russia, and Donald Trump of the United States. And two of those people, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, not only are clearly now allied together, but neither of them can be trusted to uphold any piece of paper that they sign, especially the Russian leader. I mean, again, on the Sunday television talk shows here, we saw figures from Donald Trump's inner circle parroting Putin's talking points, particularly Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence. She's the one that Hillary Clinton accused in 2015 of being a Russian agent. Absolutely. I mean, reading from the Kremlin's song sheet on American TV this morning, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, the former Fox News presenter, he announced today, before a single face-to-face negotiation occurs between the Russians and the Ukrainians, that the Department of Defense is shutting down all its operations to combat Russian cybercrime in the United States. I mean, trebles all round in the Kremlin tonight, as Vladimir Putin now knows that his troll farms can do whatever they want going forwards. The Pentagon's not going to take any action to stop them, and that follows on from Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, on her first day in office, telling the Department of Justice that she will no longer be launching prosecutions under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In other words, you want to come here and engage in bribery of American government officials, or American government officials want to go overseas and engage in bribery? Only what she described as the most egregious cases would now be prosecuted. Now, this is all, you know, a basket load of gifts to Vladimir Putin, and that's before we get to declining Ukraine, its desire to join NATO, offering Vladimir Putin the chance to return to the table at the G7, voting with Russia and North Korea at the United Nations in the General Assembly. I mean, so how do you trust two of the four people involved in this negotiation?
It's absolutely incredible what's happening at the moment. I mean, the justification for the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, is essentially putting their hands up and surrendering to Russian influence into American affairs, was that while we're trying to negotiate, it's normal practice to suspend any aggressive practices towards the country that you are negotiating with, but the aggression is coming from the other direction.
Yes, but also that's completely untrue. I mean, it was only 2 weeks ago, which seems like an eternity ago in American politics, when Keith Kellogg, supposedly Donald Trump's point person on Ukraine peace talks, this general, who knows a thing or two about Russia and Ukraine, was threatening Russia with maximum pressure, a maximum pressure campaign of fresh sanctions as the negotiating process got underway and started to catch fire. And so, I mean, he was, of course, completely sidelined because the Russians said to Trump, he's not going to have anything to do with this negotiating process. You can take him off the list. And sure enough, he then disappeared from the list. And even he was backing Donald Trump's, I thought, absolutely disgraceful treatment of Zelensky on Friday. So, look, I know that we've seen in London over the last several hours, you know, these efforts both to boost Zelensky while trying to preserve the European relationship with the United States. It's going to be really difficult to preserve that transatlantic relationship given the velocity and the trajectory of Donald Trump's determination to waltz into Vladimir Putin's arms.
And what are the Republican... presumably there's still some with a backbone. I know Lindsey Graham doesn't have one, but there has to be some in there that are raising a finger of complaint at this, no?
Yeah, we did hear from Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, who on Saturday accused Donald Trump of walking away from our allies. She said, "I am sick to my stomach as the administration appears to be walking away from our allies and embracing Putin, a threat to democracy and U.S. values around the world." Now, you know, Lisa Murkowski has never been a particular fan of Donald Trump. He's been a thorn in her side. But she is one of the few Republican voices really challenging him. She described the events in the Oval Office on Friday as a tense, shocking conversation amid whispers from the White House that they may try to end all U.S. support for Ukraine. So she's clearly got Donald Trump's number, but there just aren't enough Republicans like her to put any kind of brake on him. And to watch Lindsey Graham, a man who genuinely supports Ukraine, and even while he was reacting to Friday's events, underscored that he supports Ukraine and the heroic sacrifices that the country has made. He is a fervent critic of Vladimir Putin, but he basically fell into line behind Donald Trump, saying he'd never been prouder of an American president or vice president than he was after that ambush.
Yes. But I mean, all of the people, sorry to interrupt, but all the people that we've mentioned, if you just go back a few years, and all of them were decrying Donald Trump. They were absolutely trying to verbally bury him. I think Lindsey Graham said that he was a kook, and that was the most polite thing he said. Marco Rubio has said almost nothing good at all about Donald Trump until he became the president. J.D. Vance called him America's Hitler.
Well, Marco Rubio, I mean, if you watched him during that Oval Office meeting, as J.D. Vance started putting the shiv into Zelensky while Trump was holding Zelensky down, Marco Rubio looked physically ill. He literally sank into the sofa.
He looked like he wanted the couch to swallow him, He
wanted the couch to swallow him whole. But then he's forced to get religion. So at one point he has to prove he's got the stones to take on Zelensky in that meeting. So he lays into him. He laid into him again on American television here today. And there's one thing, by the way, that hasn't been widely reported on coming out of that Oval Office conversation. There was a moment in there where a reporter went back to the issue of what J.D. Vance had said in Munich about free speech in Britain backsliding.
Yeah.
And Trump turned to Rubio, and Rubio, in a half phrase, I mean, first of all, expressed sympathy for J.D. Vance's entirely false claims about free speech in the UK, but then indicated it's something that the State Department really needs to look at because Americans are getting caught up, apparently, in this terrible crackdown on freedom of speech in Britain. And I thought there was a bit of a threat contained in there, because it was only 24 hours after Keir Starmer had departed the White House, you know, having engaged in that charm offensive. And there was Rubio briefly sitting in the Oval Office saying, well, actually, the State Department's taking a look at free speech in the UK. It wouldn't surprise me if we hear more about that at some point.
Yeah, and it As all this is going on, still fresh in the mind is that video, that AI Trump Gaza video that that Trump tweeted, presumably before he'd actually looked at it very carefully, because included in it were images of bearded men with large breasts dancing in women's clothes, which I don't think is allied to his position in that.
I mean, you can't unsee it. I mean, I thought the imagery of Trump and Netanyahu lying on the beach chairs of Trump Gaza, quaffing what looked like cocktails or a beer, were also pretty devastating. But the most devastating thing about that video was the nature of the Riviera in the Middle East that Trump clearly wants to bring about. A playground for the wealthy, not a very, very few Palestinians in sight in that video. It wasn't clear that any Palestinians were in sight, and certainly none of the 2 million people that Donald Trump wants to expropriate their land, force them out of Gaza, and build his tropical paradise there to make loads of money out of it. But this is all about the money. With Trump and Elon Musk, this is all about the money. I don't know if you saw Musk and the Federal Aviation Administration this week. He announced that the state of air traffic control in the United States is absolutely dire. Quite by chance, his Starlink internet service is riding to the rescue, and he said he's sending the terminals to the FAA for free, which means he's covering the costs of the FedEx shipment, but he's also negotiating a multi-million-dollar contract with the Federal Aviation Administration so that his company controls air traffic control in the United States. It's all about the Benjamins.
It's a coup. Simon,
it is.
Get well. Thanks for that.
Thank you, mate.
That's Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent.